Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday, the 23rd of June, 2021. And in this program today, we will be discussing the 80th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa. And Operation Barbarossa was the Nazi German offensive against the Soviet Union that took place 80 years ago yesterday. And we'll be talking about this conflict. We'll be talking about the impact that this has had to this day. The fact that over 30 million people died in this military offensive, including 14 million civilians, and was the biggest military operation in world history. And yet it's not very widely talked about. But God. And in this program, we'll also be discussing, does God intervene in the weather? And this certainly happened over 80 years ago. And I'm joined by my co-host, Reagan King, back from his travels, back from a wedding. And good to see you, my friend.
It's good to be back, Simon. Yeah, I've missed the program, missed the viewer interactions. Always really happy to be able to join and talk through these important subjects. We have quite an important one this evening. I mean, 80 Absolutely. Years is quite a significant anniversary. And when we're considering the scale of this operation, the loss of life, but as we'll see, the wonderful and miraculous intervention and sovereignty of God in orchestrating these events, I'm sure the viewers will leave interested and inspired to learn more. So
absolutely. And what's interesting really is that we saw that Nazi Germany had a pact called the Nonaggression Pact with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was being led at the time by Joseph Stalin, same like Hitler, a totalitarian leader with total power of the state behind him. They signed a non-aggression pact, I think, in August of 1939, in which Hitler, 2 years later, broke this by invading the Soviet Union, which in a surprise attack. But it's so significant to the Russian people because this is part of the Russian narrative. This is part of the Russian story. But we don't hear the significance of this story because it doesn't involve us. It doesn't involve the British. It doesn't involve the Americans. So therefore, we don't seem to honor or pay much attention to this event because, you know, we focus on events when it comes to World War II events such as the outbreak of the war, how it started in September 1939. Of course, we discuss Dunkirk and liberation at Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, D-Day, and we also discuss V-Day. But within our national thoughts and our national remembrance, this isn't mentioned, which I think is tragic when you look at the impact that Operation Barbarossa had, and it started the beginning of the end of the fall of the Nazi regime.
Absolutely. Hitler had failed in his attempt to conquer Britain. He realized that he wasn't getting anywhere with that. And so ideologically, there was always this idea that Hitler had, is publicized even in his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, that Germany would look to the lands of the East. In fact, the quote is, we terminate the endless German drive to the south and west of Europe and direct our gaze toward the lands in the East. If we talk about new soil and territory in Europe today, we can think primarily only of Russia and its vassal border states. So this pre-existed the war even, this idea of a future conquering and a future totalitarian takeover of Russia for the sake of the spread of the Aryan race. And the idea would be that the Slavic people would then be enslaved under the superior Aryans. I mean, we're talking about really, really messed up, nationalistic, in the extreme, ideology rooted in hate of one's fellow man, and also evolutionary theory we're superior, we're the best, we're the supreme beings on earth. There was also out of this influencing this desire to see the Treaty of Versailles completely destroyed. That was something that always Hitler and the Nazis had at the back of their minds throughout the war. They believed Germany had a really rotten deal out of World War I. And so this act of aggression against Russia was also seeking to regain some pride out of, along with the rest of the takeovers that were occurring. Communism was hated. Let's destroy that. And increasing Germany's size for its own power.
Yeah, because if we take a step back in history during the First World War, it was the Russians were on the side of the British and the French against the Germans, and then of course we had the Communist Revolution took place in October 1917, which then the Russians pulled out. The Bolshevik Revolution pulled out of that war, so there wasn't any real grievance really between the Germans and the Soviet Unions, but posed a threat. There was a mutual distrust of each other. And what was interesting is that this happened 80 years ago yesterday on the 22nd of June, 1941. And it was called Operation Barbarossa after the 12th century German Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, who led the Third Crusade against Saladin and his Islamic forces to conquer Jerusalem. Now,
is it successful?
Well, this is the big question, isn't it? That what we found out from here is that Hitler wasn't much of a historian. If he had been, he'd realised that Frederick Barbarossa actually drowned in a river in Anatolia in Turkey on his way to fight Saladin and the Crusade. So it was a disastrous campaign on behalf of Frederick Barbarossa. And also the fact is that I think Hitler also ignored what happened with Napoleon, who also invaded Moscow and tried to invade Russia, and that ended disastrously for Napoleon.
1812, winter, horrible, catastrophic loss, very definitely the end of Napoleon's gain in prominence and power across Europe.
Absolutely. So also say, but just to remind you, we are live, we are interactive tonight. So this isn't a program without your emails or your text messages. So please feel free to email into the program. And tonight's question we're posing is, does God use the weather to intervene in human history? As you'll find out later in this program, that history is his story. What was interesting here, look at this one here, for example, an historian called Wendy Lover writes, the ultimate aim of the war of destruction against the Soviet Union was to make a Garden of Eden out of the new territories won in the East, in particular in the Ukraine. Germany planned to colonize western parts of the Soviet Union, especially the rich resource lands of the Ukraine, as it had colonized certain areas of Poland. This would involve expelling the inferior races such as Slavs and Jews who lived there and settling ethnic Germans in their place. So all of this whole operation, and certainly the officers involved in Operation Barbarossa didn't see this as just another kind of German mission to invade the Netherlands, Belgium, France, or even Greece, but this one had a special racial mission attached to it. And the soldiers who took part in this, the Wehrmacht, were ideologically driven to attack the Slavs, to attack the Jewish people on this whole premise of the Aryan race, that the Germans were a superior race, according to the theory of social Darwinism, that only the strongest would survive, and Germany was the strongest, so therefore they would drive, and this pushed this drive eastward.
Absolutely, and in regard to this endeavor through Operation Barbarossa to establish a racial entity, this was sold as often these sorts of acts of evil are, as a necessary act, a racial war against the Jewish and Slavic races. And if we look at from the time of the invasion, the 22nd of June, to the end of 1941, 500,000 Jews were murdered in the territories that were captured in Operation Barbarossa. So we see very clearly the heavy racial element. It's following Hitler's MO. The Jews need to be destroyed. Anyone who's not Aryan, the Slavs, there's a lasting history of aggression between the Slavs and the Germans. So we can look at this and say Hitler is wanting to fulfill all of the disappointments of history in the past. He's wanting to exterminate the Jews. He's wanting to establish a worldwide kingdom of this superior Aryan race.
And he nearly succeeded. This is an interesting quote. So back in May 1941, the German general, Erich Hoppner, issued the following orders to his soldiers. He said, "The war against Russia is a fundamental part of the German people's struggle for existence. It is the old struggle of the Germans against the Slavs, the defense of European culture against the Moscovites, the Asiatics deluge, the defense against Jewish Bolshevism. The struggle must aim to smash Russia of today into rubble, and as a consequence, it must be carried out with unprecedented harshness." So I think this was the speech, and this is what the Wehrmacht, which was the German army, were actually called to do in this operation. And also, we have to understand that by attacking the Soviet Union, effectively Hitler was opening up a third front, a war in the east, whilst British forces fought against German forces, probably in North Africa and on the fringes of the empire. But Hitler had total control of Western Europe.
Made no sense from any military standpoint. This is Hitler overreaching. This is Hitler pressing much too far. And as we'll see, he, through this, met his undoing. We have a very good email here. This is from Graham. Hi, Simon. Welcome back. Reagan. Thank you, Graham. Psalm 148, verse 8. The storms, quote, do his bidding, end quote. What about Jonah chapter 1? God sent a great wind into the sea. He is sovereign. But how do we know it's God? God bless you, Graham. Thank you for that. And that's true, that the storms do his bidding. We can't always know every element, every reason that things happen as they do. But one thing, Graham, whenever I've encountered something that I find personally inconveniencing or difficult, it could be weather-wise, it could be something else related, that I have to entrust it to God's sovereignty and know that he has a plan and is going to work things out. Clearly, in this bigger picture event that we're talking about this evening, is what we'll see. God had a plan and worked it out. We also have here the question, wasn't Napoleon's retreating army from Moscow badly affected by the freezing conditions? And that's a simple yes. The weather produced extreme loss of life. They were totally unprepared, and that was also Napoleon's undoing. This is from Pauline in Leicestershire. If we look back to the time of Noah and the flood, then my answer is yes. I'm sure that there have been many other occasions. God bless you both. And we can continue to go through the Bible even and see time after time where God uses storms. He uses
hailstones.
Absolutely. I mean, we think about what happened in Exodus and some of the events, the catastrophes that were part of the plagues of Egypt, and those would have, to eyes at the time of the Egyptians, been deemed as, to some degree, weather-related. And so definitely, I think we're already answering the question. God does, but keep sending out your observations, biblical observations, maybe a personal story or two. Does God use the weather to accomplish his purpose? That's the key question that we're asking.
Absolutely, and we'll find out more as the program progresses, really. Yeah. So essentially, what happened we mentioned earlier in the program that Hitler signed this Non-Aggression Pact with Stalin, with the Soviet Union, but I think the Russians were already becoming concerned about this and not trusting Hitler or the German forces. He had a notorious track record of going back on his promises. You only have to see the Neville Chamberlain wave the white flag and say this is peace in our time to realise that he went back on previous agreements after taking the Sudetenland and then took Czechoslovakia and Austria and then went on to invade Poland. But Stalin had a guy called Mikhail Chervorsky, who was a charismatic commander of the Red Army, who helped defeat the Tsarist forces, advised Stalin to take up measures to rearm and to prepare the Soviet Union for war with the possibility of confronting the Nazis. So in Russia, they saw an increase of 82,000 artillery, 7,000 new tanks, 70% increase in aircraft and armored vehicles. So we can see their original archive footage of Operation Barbarossa, and we have the German planes getting ready to bomb the Soviet Union. So of course this actually happened, but it wasn't until December 1940 that Hitler issued something called the Directive 21, Operation Barbarossa, where he told his forces to actually prepare for the invasion of the Soviet Union, and he would deploy 3/4 of the German Wehrmacht forces to invade the Soviet Union together with the Axis forces. So equivalent of around over 3 million German and Axis powers forces ready to take on the Soviet Union with its border that ranges from about 1,800 miles, the biggest military conflict in human history.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And what strikes me as interesting is, was reading up again on this operation, is that Stalin was actually warned. He was warned that this attack was going to be taking place. He was warned that the Nazis were going to be completely rubbishing their agreement of 1939. And while there were these preparations which you've spoken of that were being made, there was a sense of we're involved in this, we're going to be involved in this. At the same time, there was a total lack of preparedness for the invasion when it began on the 22nd of June, 80 years ago. German generals had warned Hitler that occupying Western Russia would create more of a drain than a relief for Germany's economic situation. So Stalin may very well have thought, well, okay, what's the benefit? And I think any military tactician could look at the scenario and look at particularly the inability of the Luftwaffe to take over and to successfully destroy the Royal Air Force, the Battle of Britain. That might, you would think, have set a red flag to Hitler, saying from a military standpoint, no, this is, I'm not going to go ahead and launch a full-scale offensive into Russia, but this is the downfall of everyone who's consumed by power and pride and a desire for their own way and their own will to succeed. They will fall to it. So failing on this front, he pursues another front, and with catastrophic impact. Initially, though, Hitler looks like he was a genius and was successful.
I mean, one of the main reasons also, despite the ideological imperative for Hitler to actually invade the Soviet Union and take control of the Ukraine, was mainly because of the crops and the agriculture in order to actually provide food for the German troops and German population. But the other reason was because they wanted the Soviet oil fields, so that they could then have enough oil in order to launch further kind of military campaigns, and that was a kind of another reason. And that's why they were kind of pushing through this. But But Hitler thought because he used the same tactics against the Netherlands, against Belgium, against France, in which the British Expeditionary Force found herself completely cut off at Dunkirk, the whole blitzkrieg tactic. And they deployed this incredibly effectively. So effectively using infantry together with the panzer divisions, these very, very fast tanks, and the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, in order to completely dismantle and attack Soviet forces in Eastern Europe and drive at an incredible pace. And of course, that's what the Germans were very effective at doing. But they thought they were going to win this in months. We already saw that Stalin had purged the leadership of the Red Army because he mistrusted them. So Hitler thought they're not up for this. The Russian people themselves didn't actually support communism, so I didn't think that they were going to be up for the fight. So therefore, this was easy takings. And the first couple of months, right in the summer, we saw incredible German advances deep into the Soviet Union.
When they began to employ this tactic of blitzkrieg, they certainly believed that it was going to be successful. They didn't even prepare their troops with winter clothing. They did not have special lubricant for the tanks and other vehicles that would be needed. And so when they encountered resistance due to underestimating, in many cases, I think, the amount of might and military build-up that the Soviet Union had accumulated in 10 years, they found themselves in a very difficult situation where they had fewer people who were taking their side, fewer people were giving in, that there were dissidents, there were insurgents. As they went through, they were finding themselves going at such pace that there were pockets that they weren't impacting. They were invading, but you can look at the course of their invasion and you can see there are whole pockets that haven't been taken over. And so they actually find themselves in a very dangerous situation where they've invaded too far without clearing the way, without clearing the entirety of the terrain, and really opening themselves to being picked off by various people, sandwiched in between insurgents.
Not having enough supply lines.
Exactly.
An army can't fight a battle without adequate resupplying of fuel, of ammunition, of food for the soldiers. But I mean, it's also very interesting that I had a guest on the Middle East Report yesterday that said he was fascinated with this period of history. And he thinks that the German soldiers, the Wehrmacht, actually took drugs, performance-enhancing drugs, in order for them to have that advantage. He said this is what they did against France and against Belgium, and they could fight 3 days without actually needing any sleep. So we see some incredible desire to invade the Soviet Union.
So have some more contact here. Hello, thanks for another great show. God used the weather in Jonah. The harder the mariners rowed for the shore, the worse the tempest became. In invading Russia, the further they went and the longer they were there, the worse it was for the Germans. Another, and this is from Dylan, your discussion on Hitler is interesting, and I wish you saw what I saw. My neighbor who lived above me, I was invited in one night and sat down. I had a look up on the wall, and there was a portrait of Hitler on the wall. I decided not to stay too long when I discovered I saw a small stack of Nazi books on the floor. And I never could go in again because I hated the atmosphere. I then found out he actually supported the Nazis and hates the Jewish people. So you're right, Dylan, that tragically this battle, this fight in many ways ideologically still goes on, and it's a real tragedy. Greetings in Jesus' name. Jesus said, don't fight flesh and blood. His kingdom is spiritual and visible, not physical. His Father is within. Our fight is with spiritual forces, not people. No liar or murderer will enter the kingdom. Human war is hideous, no glory in it whatsoever. And I would say I've read on the rest there, there is an important reality if we read the entirety of God's word, that some war is unjust and some war is just, and it is absolutely inarguable as I believe that...
I don't think you can separate the physical from the spiritual.
No.
Because, I mean, one thing that the Germans did, particularly with the SS, and the SS were obsessed with the occult, was that they would practice occultic practices before they would launch an invasion. So literally what would happen on a spiritual level is that the spiritual forces of darkness would invade that territory first. Then you'd have the physical armies of the SS and the German Wehrmacht actually launching an attack and actually taking that territory. And of course we had Rhys, the British intercessor based in Wales, that was praying and interceding for the course of the war. So, you know, there's no separation between the physical and the spiritual. And yes, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but the powers of darkness was unbelievable in terms of what Hitler was able to do and conjure up. I mean, his speeches were inspired by Satan himself, and the whole of the SS were obsessed with the occult and using the occult to gain a spiritual advantage in Germany's conquest of Europe and the rest of the world and world domination.
Remember, Paul, as well, that God operates in history. He is outside of time and space, but he operates in time and space. And while World War II, no war should be about claiming territory for the kingdom of Christ. That's the context in which Jesus was speaking. We don't win people to the gospel through warfare. There is still righteousness and justice that must be achieved, and God works in and through that. Hitler and his ideology and his motive
but spiritually, though, his main objective was to completely annihilate and destroy the Jewish people, so that the modern state of Israel couldn't be rebuilt. And therefore, promises referring to the restoration of Israel and the Jewish people wouldn't be happening, because he was Satan's agent. So
God powerfully intervenes.
Absolutely. So going back to Sunday, the 22nd of June, 1941, we saw that some 4 million soldiers, German soldiers, together with our allies, attacked the Soviet Union along the 1,800-mile frontier. Never in human history have we witnessed the deployment of such massive forces against another country. This invasion was supported by 600,000 armed vehicles and some 700,000 horses. Operation Barbarossa represented the largest invasion force of the war, representing some 80% of the German Wehrmacht, on what was the most powerful invasion force in history. The German invasion caught the Red Army, according to my notes here, unprepared, with a three-pronged attack towards Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Ukraine in the south. German panzer divisions and the Luftwaffe we saw in that archive video footage helped Germany gain an early advantage against the numerous but poorly trained Soviet troops. On the first day of the attack alone, the Luftwaffe managed to shoot down more than 1,000 Soviet aircraft. And then we see that German forces initially moved quickly along the vast front, taking millions of Soviet soldiers prisoners. The Unskrop-Gruppen, or the armed SS death squads, followed in the army's wake, and they would carry out the most hideous assassination attempts, not actually taking any Soviet soldiers prisoners, just killing them on the spot. And one of Hitler's directives of the invasion included the order that which authorized the immediate execution of all captured enemy officers. Many Soviet prisoners of war were also killed upon capture, and another practice that violated international war protocols like the Red Cross.
We fast forward into early October when Hitler orders the launch of Operation Typhoon, the German offensive against Moscow. The delay had given the Soviets time to strengthen the defense of their capital with some 1 million troops and 1,000 new T-34 tanks. And after successful initial assaults, the muddy roads of autumn known as Rapotitsa or Quagmire season, stalled the German offensive outside of Moscow, where they run into improved Russian defenses. Meanwhile, the siege of Leningrad, one of the aims of Operation Barbarossa, heavy artillery shelling on the city begins on the 1st of September of 1941. All roads to the city were blocked so that fuel and food supplies could not reach the people at all. So the attempt, and this was a massive part of Hitler's strategy in Operation Barbarossa, was starvation. Let's starve the people. We're going to slay as many people as we can. We're going to enslave others to do our work. This is in view of capturing the Slavs, and we're going to starve people into submission. Hitler and his generals expected Leningrad to drop like a leaf. Never in the history of mankind had such onslaught met such resistance. Food supplies stopped. Germans bombed power stations so that there was no electricity and heating. Food stocks dwindled to the point that they could not be replenished. Rationing was unsuccessful, and people were brewing broths of leaves, seaweed, eating grease from machinery, and then cats and dogs. It's estimated that about 1 million people died of starvation during the siege of Leningrad. It's a catastrophic loss of life in this operation. Never before in modern history had an enemy laid siege to a city to starve its people out in that particular way, quelling them into submission. Those who lived through 900 days, imagine 900 days under siege, being starved, could never banish the horrific images of starvation and death. Stalin showed incredible callousness as well. He did not lift the siege because he wanted the full power of the Red Army to concentrate on Stalingrad, the city that bore his name.
Absolutely tragic. So, but to bring a little bit more of a historical perspective to Operation Barbarossa and the 80th anniversary of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, we have a special guest on tonight's Behind the Headlines. We're now joined on Behind the Headlines by Rhys Parkinson, who's a retired major in the British Army and also the director of the Armed Forces Christian Union, to mark the 80th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa that marked the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Rhys, it's great to have you on the programme, and would very much like your thoughts really on this 80th anniversary and why it's not getting as much press coverage as it should, why it's not getting enough public attention, because this was a major war that really started the beginning of the end of the fall of the German Reich.
Yeah, thank you again for having me on your show, Simon. It's always a pleasure. Indeed, I think the significance is that it's not only marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War, as the Nazis took on way too much in terms of opening up a second or arguably a third front and coalescing the Allies against them, but actually we're still living with the aftermath of this operation, the way that the Russians in particular view the modern world, the fact that for the latter half of the 20th century, we had a Cold War with the East facing off against the West. The fact that we have NATO even today still functioning and operating arguably traces very much back to the decision by Hitler and the Nazi regime to invade Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union, on the 22nd of June, 1941.
And Rhys, 80 years on from the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, and knowing that over 30 million people died on the Eastern Front with this German war against the Soviet Union, why is it so important that we remember and reflect on this war 80 years on?
Well, I think you've alluded to it there. You know, the sheer loss of life. Nobody knows exactly how many people died. 30 million is an estimate. It was utterly brutal. It resulted, as you say, in the direct death, in combat of a very small percentage of that 30 million figure. Many more died of starvation. Many were deliberately murdered in the atrocities that followed behind the front line, and over the three or more years that the Germans were fighting on Russian soil. I think it's important to remember not only where we've come from, but to recognize the mistakes of the past, and I think to reflect on those, to make sure that, you know, in the modern era, we don't make the same mistakes that have been made by our forebears before us, and to perhaps, with a somber mind, recognize the sacrifice of the past, and celebrate the freedom that we have and the relative peace that we've enjoyed, certainly in Europe and the West, in the last sort of 75 years or so.
And Rhett, what do you think lay behind the decision of Adolf Hitler to invade the Soviet Union, to break his agreement with Stalin, which was known as the Non-Aggression Pact that he signed in August of 1939, and launch a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union?
Well, I think some of it, certainly reading around it a little bit, goes back to Hitler's doctrine or view of the world, which he articulated a bit of it as early as 1925 in Mein Kampf, where he talked about invading Russia. So that it was certainly in his mind. I think as they got closer, they justified it because they needed Lebensraum, you know, living space. I think there was a real sense of arrogance, racism even. The Aryan race was the chosen race. You know, the Third Reich was going to live for 1,000 years. They needed or perceived a need to get more food. Obviously, the Allies and you know, led by Britain at this stage, America hadn't entered the war in June 41, were blockading the ports and food coming in through those ports. And so Ukraine was a very attractive area in terms of cereal production and other things. And there was just a feeling that, you know, they had a plan for 1,000 years. So that actually they were looking for the room and the resources in order to realize that plan. The other thing was they needed fuel, and I think that became evident fairly early on, and therefore, you know, the Russians had that in Azerbaijan and other places that down in the Balkans that was very attractive as a resource, and arguably the Japanese were doing much the same on the other side of the world, trying to secure more resource for their people so that they could expand.
And Rhett, according to my notes here, that what was so chilling about this Nazi military offensive against the Soviet Union was the fact that the German officers who took part in this war were motivated on a mission for racial purity, to completely annihilate the Jewish populations in Eastern Europe and in Russia, as well as the Slavic populations as well. Now, looking back 80 years on, it doesn't seem that this was possible, but does this also explain why ordinary German soldiers, members of the Wehrmacht and not the SS, also carried out the most horrific atrocities against civilians, against Jews, and against the Slavic people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very difficult, isn't it, for us to sit here in the 21st century and try and think back. But I think the German people had been conditioned in all sorts of ways through their experiences in coming out of the First World War, where they'd been very much humiliated, a lot of disquiet and unease and upheaval politically and in fact in terms of security and so on through the 1920s. And when Hitler and the National Socialist Party came to power in 1932, they promised so much, and the German people went with it. What I don't think were conscious of initially was a very sort of sinister underlying message that they were a superior race, and that actually these other people, particularly the Jews and the Slavs, weren't even considered really as people. They were almost vermin, or painted as that over the coming years. And you had Kristallnacht in 1938. I think it was my birthday, 9th of November 1938, thereabouts, where ordinary German people, or certainly the party and the more committed members of the Nazi party, went and murdered dozens, potentially hundreds of Jews, and destroyed an awful lot of Jewish businesses, burnt their synagogues and so on. So that by 1941, where we're considering Operation Barbarossa, that had become very much part of their psyche, and they were starting to round up the Jews, put them into slave camps, and in many cases concentration camps, and the early part of the mass genocide against the Jews had, which we now know as the Holocaust, had started, albeit obviously not trumpeted, but very much part of the way that the Nazi machine was operating.
And Rhett, can you tell us what the Nazi military objectives were? Because according to a bit of research I've done, they amassed almost 3/4 of their armed forces, together with the Axis powers as well, for a kind of 3-wave pronged attack on Russia, starting with Leningrad, and then Moscow, and Stalingrad, and the Ukraine to the south to take Kiev. What was their objectives, and was that really achievable through blitzkrieg to cripple and invade Russia?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, very much the largest military operation the world had ever seen. 3 million Germans or Axis forces invading. All sorts of reasons why they were invading. They thought the Russians would not fight. If they adopted blitzkrieg operations very quickly, the Russians would fold. Some of the reasons go back to the First World War. They had their first-rate divisions on the Western Front, and in 4 years never made any significant progress. They had second-rate divisions in there on the Eastern Front, and after 2 years, they ostensibly won. They overthrew or achieved a peace there. And so, having watched in May 1940 what they thought the Germans thought were their strongest opponents, the French in the first instance, and having chased the Brits off the mainland continent of Europe, they thought, well, we've done it much more easily than we did in the First World War. We've had sort of huge success. I think they factored in that Stalin had purged the senior leadership of the Red Army. And they thought that the army wouldn't fight. The lessons that came out of some of the other things that happened in terms of going into Poland relatively easily and so on, they thought they could achieve with blitzkrieg a quick win, and they were hugely successful in those first few months. They thought the Red Army consisted of about 3 million soldiers, and they took killed or captured something like 3 million in those first stages, a total of over 5 million in the end, of which more than half died mainly of starvation, ultimately in German hands. And I think they thought they'd achieve that very, very quickly, and the Russians would roll over, sue for peace, and that would take the Russians out, and then they could turn their attention and maybe get Britain to sue for peace, because what other options did Britain have? No friends in the wider world, certainly not from the Americans, or yes, drawing on the Commonwealth, but they really thought knocking out the Russians very quickly would happen, and that would cease or remove their major threat on their Eastern Front, and they could then consolidate their gains and populate these newly won lands that they'd captured.
And Rhett, do you believe that we saw the intervention of God in this conflict, particularly to do with the weather and the El Nino effect, that the Nazi forces in Germany faced the worst winter for generations in terms of the cold, in terms of the snow, which slowed down Germans' ability to advance against Moscow and other major cities in Germany, which ultimately led to their defeat?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can certainly say that. I think the weather was a major factor, and you know, as a follower of Jesus Christ and a believer, you know, God is in charge of the weather. It played a huge role. I don't think it was the only role. I think it was one of many factors that played a role in the German defeat. Of course, you know, they planned blitzkrieg and a quick win, so they hadn't really planned for winter. The Russians drew or had time because the Germans paused to clear up pockets in their rear and take hundreds of thousands, millions of prisoners. It allowed them to pull in Serbian divisions that were used to fighting in the winter, divisions on the Mongolian front, because they felt you know, more secure on that front, and the threat was clearly to Moscow and to that area. But there were a number of times where they either had freezing weather, which slowed them down, and then it thawed, and that made everything muddy, which caused major problems to their supply lines, as well as physically moving across the ground.
Well, thank you very much for that interview with Rhett there, Simon. We have some good emails here. Les says, God can use anything, including weather, to bring his purposes to pass. Also, one nation to destroy another nation. He is God. He can do anything he wants to. Of course, if he leaves people or nations to their own devices, they can destroy themselves. I heard that Stalin shook his fist at God before he died. Certainly did not impress God. Here's some more scripture references. Joshua 10 verse 13, the sun stood still and the moon stopped. And verse 11, the Lord hurled large hailstones, and more killed by them than by the sword. Isaiah 28 verse 17, the waters will flood your hiding place. Also, when our troops needed evacuating, God made the North Sea like a milk pond, and lots of small boats could sail on it, and canal boats. And these are flat-bottomed craft. Under normal circumstances, you would be laughed at, but God made a way. He said, I'm taking my narrow boat across the North Sea. That's from Gordon.
Absolutely. So where we see the intervention in Operation, God's intervention in Operation Barbarossa with the German Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union occurred in the autumn when the rains came. So the rains turned the roads to mud. The tanks sank in more than 6 feet of mud in some places, and the Germans desperately pushed on before the Russian winter came into full blast. And this was the actual winter that occurred in the winter of 1941. And they said even by Russian standards, it was brutal. Temperatures plunged to minus 40 degrees in places, freezing German tanks and equipment, shutting down diesel engines, and freezing German soldiers who were not equipped with coats, hats, proper boots, gloves, or anything necessary to fight a winter campaign. And then we saw that fresh Russian divisions came to the front from the Ural Mountains, hundreds of thousands of men. The weather gave the Russians time and preparation needed to dig trenches, build defenses, and push back the Germans from Moscow. So essentially, because the El Nino effect, the weather was extra cold, even by Russian standards. And it was the coldest time for generations in Russia that effectively stopped the Nazi advance, because they were so close to Moscow, I think within 22 miles of Moscow. And had they advanced on the capital, there's no doubt they would have actually taken Moscow, and the whole of the Soviet Union would collapsed. Here we see again, it was the rain that prevented this time, and then the freezing snow. And it was actually the weather that actually changed history.
It's incredible how God worked in and through this scenario and situation. And indeed, there would have been even more catastrophic loss of life than there was had he not done so. The 80th anniversary of the invasion of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, the German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier spoke at the German-Russian Museum in Berlin, Kornhorst, on Friday to commemorate the 80th anniversary. And he said, nobody during this war mourned more victims than the people of the former Soviet Union. He added that the German war against the Soviets was carried out with, quote, murderous barbarity, end quote. It weighs on us that our fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers who waged this war were involved in these crimes. Simon, what we're looking at is a whole nation that, according to the German president, arguably has as its fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers war criminals.
No, absolutely, which is frightening. And this is the other aspect of this conflict and Operation Barbarossa, the sheer brutality of the German Wehrmacht, particularly because before the Germans liked to blame the SS. But this was actually the ordinary German soldier that was also responsible for committing war crimes and also acts of genocide. And of course, this is we saw Baba Yar, the horrendous murder of the Jewish people in the Ukraine. But let's take one step back. If it wasn't for this freezing cold weather, if it wasn't for this massive, great thick snow, if it wasn't for the flooding and the fact that the Germans couldn't get their vehicles up and running, they couldn't mobilize their army, what would the impact have been on the Second World War? It would have been a totally different outcome. Hitler would have marched through to Moscow, taken Moscow, which means that they would have had the oil to continue military offences deep into North Africa and the Middle East. It would also mean that they could probably then have recruit enough soldiers and firepower to actually re-invade Britain again for a second time. And effectively, the world would have been controlled by the Nazis. So here we see God's intervention in human history. We saw it with Napoleon and the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, which they had an incredible storms took place that stopped the speed of Napoleon's forces, which gave time for the Prussians to come to the defense of the British, and we defeated Napoleon in 1815 and stop the construction of a United States of Europe. The other time, we saw the Angels of Mons in the First World War, where literally these angelic forces stopped the advancement of German imperial troops, which then prevented the British actually losing the First World War. Then we also have the incredible story of Dunkirk, where over 340,000 British and French troops were stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk, and the sea across the English Channel was calm, as it's been in generations. But where the Luftwaffe were based, massive heavy storms they couldn't take off, which then stopped the German advance. And then, of course, then we have D-Day with the rough seas. They didn't expect us to land. And so I think, therefore, history is his story, where we see God's intervention in the affairs of humanity. And this is another case where this happened.
God overturns the natural, the norm, what we perceive as what's going to happen. Had Nazi Germany succeeded in conquering the USSR, we would have then seen the possibility of them succeeding in an Asian front of the war. What could have stopped them?
Japan. Absolutely. And then, of course, the Americans came in, so we have to save that for December. Just want to thank you for watching today's Behind the Headlines as we've marked the 80th anniversary of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa. And again, we see that God has intervened in human history. After all, history is his story. And if it wasn't for these snowstorms, it wasn't for the El Nino effect, then it would have been certain that the Nazi forces would have conquered the Soviet Union. The war would have been different. But God, and we thank you that he intervenes in human history and he is sovereign. So thank you for joining us on Behind the Headlines.